Hi, my name is Holly. I'm a manager at Edison Ford Winter Estates, and each month I do the digital discussion. This month it's on a very interesting man, Frederick Douglass, and I've learned a lot. And there's a lot I couldn't even fit in because there's so much to say about him and what he accomplished. This is his home in Washington, D.C. The last 10 or so years of his life, maybe a little longer, he was there. Frederick Douglass, abolitionist, lecturer, author. He escaped enslavement, journalist, women's rights supporter, and vice presidential candidate. Frederick Douglass was born into slavery about 1818 in Talbot County. He wasn't sure of his exact date of birth, so if you look it up, you will find several different answers. But he later celebrated his birthday on February 14th, which was Valentine's Day. His mother was an enslaved Black woman and his father was white, and he was born Frederick Bailey, and he took the name Douglass after he escaped. His full name at birth was Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. And after he was separated from his mother as a baby, Douglass lived with his maternal grandmother, Betty Bailey. However, at the age of 6, he was moved to live and work on the Y House plantation in Maryland. Harriet Bailey worked as a field hand on another plantation, and she had to walk more than 12 miles to visit her son, her child, whom she only met a few times in his life. This is so tragic. He described her as tall and finely proportioned, of dark, glossy complexion with regular features, and amongst the slaves was remarkably sedate and dignified. And I'm quoting Douglass on that. She died when he was about 7 years old. As an adult, Douglass learned that his mother had been the only Black person in what was then Talbot County who could read, because people that were enslaved weren't allowed to read or learn how to read the majority of the time. In 1826, around age 8, he was sent to live with Hugh and Sophia Auld, and this is important that you remember this, at Felds Point, Baltimore. Hugh's brother, Captain Thomas Auld, was the son-in-law of Douglass's owner, Aaron Anthony. So he had an owner. How appalling that he was owned. Douglass's responsibility in Baltimore was to care for Hugh and Sophia's young son, Thomas. Sophia began teaching Douglass how to read along with her son. The lessons ended suddenly, however, when Hugh discovered what had been taking place and told Sophia that literacy would, quote, spoil a slave. In Maryland, like many other slaveholding states, it was illegal to teach enslaved people how to read and write. And Douglass continued to learn in secret by trading bread for lessons from poor white boys he played with in the neighborhood, and by tracing the letters in Thomas's old school books. So he had a thirst for knowledge. In January of 1833, Douglass was leased to a nearby farmer, Edward Covey. Covey was known as a slave breaker, and that's in quotations, someone who abused slaves physically and psychologically to make them more compliant, because they would break them down by their abuse. According to Douglass, Covey's abuse led to a climatic confrontation 6 months into Douglass's time with the farmer. One day, Covey attacked Douglass, and Douglass fought back. The two men engaged in a 2-hour-long physical struggle. Douglass ultimately won the fight, and Covey never attacked him again. Douglass was determined to protect himself from any physical assault from anyone in the future. In January of 1834, Douglass was sent to William Freeland's farm. Living and working conditions were better under Freeland. However, Douglass still desired freedom. No matter how good your enslavers are, if they even seem like decent people, they are enslaving them. So no, it's not good. It's never good. While living with Freeland, he started a Sabbath school in which he taught Blacks how to read and write. Along with 4 other enslaved men, Douglass plotted to escape north by taking a large canoe up the coast of Maryland and to proceed to Pennsylvania. But their plot was discovered. Douglass and the other participants were arrested. Captain Auld then sent Douglass back to Baltimore to live again with Hugh and Sophia Auld and learn a trade. And I wanted to mention one thing that I read. If you notice in any of his pictures, he is not smiling. And he said that that was because he wanted to shatter the myth that they were happy blacks enslaved. Happy, he would have said happy black slaves. That was a caricature and it wasn't true. Hugh Hall hired Frederick out to local shipyards as a ship caulker. Douglass was paid by the shipyards for his work. He would then give his earnings to Auld, gave Douglass a small percentage of them, and it was a very small percentage. And Douglass would eventually hire out his own time, which meant he paid Auld a set amount every week, but was responsible for his own food and clothing. During this time, Douglass became more involved in Baltimore's Black community, where he met Anna Murray, a free Black woman whom he would eventually marry. Douglass moved about Baltimore with few restrictions, but that came to an end when he decided to attend a religious meeting outside of Baltimore on a Saturday and postpone paying all his weekly fee. You can imagine that didn't go over well. The following Monday, when Douglass returned, all threatened him. After that, Douglass was determined to escape. He escaped in September 1838 by dressing as a sailor and traveling from Baltimore to Wilmington, Delaware by train, and then to Philadelphia by steamboat, and there to New York City by train. Black sailors in the 19th century traveled with documents granting them protection under the American flag, and that is specifically because they were sailors. Douglass used those documents to pay for his passage north with the help of Anna, who, according to family lore, so the family story, said that she sold her feather bed to finance his escape. And that's a picture of his wife, Anna, but that's not in the time period we were talking about. That's the only picture I could find, and that dates to 1860, which is 22 years later than what time period we're talking about. Frederick and Anna had 5 children together: Rosetta, Lewis Henry, Frederick Jr., Charles, and Annie, who died at age 10. Charles and Rosetta assisted their father in the production of his newspaper, the North Star. Anna was always a supporter of Douglass's public work, despite stress in their marriage caused by his relations with other women. His relationships with Julia Griffith and Ottilie Assing, that's a German name. I'm sorry that I butchered it. 2 women with whom he was professionally involved caused speculation and scandal. Assing was a journalist recently immigrated from Germany who first visited Douglass in 1856, seeking permission to translate his biography, My Bondage and Freedom, into German. Until 1872, she often stayed at his house for several months at a time as his intellectual and emotional companion. So I want you to think of how that must have been for Anna. Let me read a little more, though. Assing held Anna Douglass in utter contempt and was desperately hoping that Douglass would separate from his wife. Douglass's biographer, David W. Blight, concludes that Assing and Douglass were probably lovers. Though Douglass and Assing are widely believed to have had an intimate relationship, there's no proof in their correspondence. According to the National Park Service, Anna worked binding shoes and doing laundry to keep the family out of debt. Although she was a free woman, she did not read or write, so little is known about her life. And so this woman was a white woman, and she lived with them, and she had utter contempt for Anna, I think, because she couldn't read and write, because Anna didn't have that opportunity. And this woman was German, and she would come and stay with them for the summer. The next to last year of her life, she did not come. And she eventually died. But I want you to think about what it must have been like for Anna, even if there was no physical affair going on. It certainly was demoralizing for her husband to have an emotional companion and an intellectual companion, meaning that she did not measure up. So Frederick Douglass accomplishes and does amazing things. But I do have to say that this one thing probably was hurtful to his family, but it is not my place to speak about it. So there he is with his daughter, Anna, when she's 10 years old. And there his other daughter named Rosetta. And the other daughter was named Annie. And then he has three sons, Frederick Jr., Charles, and Lewis Henry. New York was a dangerous place for enslaved freedom seekers. Many slave catchers traveled there to catch them because that was a place that was relatively easy, but not really, but compared to some other places to get to. None of this was easy. There were people who were willing for money, though, to tell the authorities about people trying to escape enslavement. For protection, Douglass changed his name from Frederick Bailey to Frederick Johnson. A chance meeting with Black abolitionist David Ruggles led Douglass to safety. Anna arrived in New York several days later, safely, because remember, she's a free Black woman. And she arrived in New York several days later, and they were married in Ruggles' parlor. Kind of like a living room. Ruggles encouraged them to move to New Bedford, Massachusetts, a whaling port. Frederick could find work as a caulker, and the couple would be welcome in a free Black and fugitive slave community. There they met Nathan and Mary Johnson, a married couple who were born free persons of color. I apologize. It was the Johnsons who inspired the couple to take the name Douglass after the character in Sir Walter Scott's poem, The Lady of the Lake. I love that part of it, that they inspired them on a poem by a British poet. In New Bedford, Douglass began attending abolitionist movement meetings. During these meetings, he was exposed to the writings of abolitionists and journalist William Lloyd Garrison. And this is Nathan and Polly Johnson's home in New Bedford, Massachusetts. It's now a natural historic landmark. And New Bedford is a very cool place to visit if you haven't been there. The two men eventually met when both were asked to speak in an abolitionist meeting. At the meeting, Douglass shared his story of slavery and his escape. It was Garrison who encouraged Douglass to become a speaker and a leader in the abolitionist movement. And William Lloyd Garrison, that's his picture there, was definitely a strong abolitionist. But that doesn't mean that everybody shares the exact same views, as you'll find out. Certainly freedom from enslavement, but there was much, much more. In 1843, Douglass became the part of the American Anti-Slavery Society's 100th Conventions Project, a 6-month tour through the United States. And he was physically assaulted several times during the tour by people opposed to the abolitionist movement. They weren't in favor of having people free from enslavement. In a brutal attack in Pendleton, Indiana, Douglass's hand was broken, and the injuries never completely healed, and he never regained full use of his hand. In 1845, Douglass published his first autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, written by himself. Prior to its publication, audiences at Douglass's lectures had questioned his authenticity as an ex-slave because of his eloquence. How insulting. Douglass would publish 2 additional biographies, My Bondage and My Freedom in 1855, and The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass in 1881. The narrative quickly became popular, especially in Europe, but the book's success made Hugh Auld determined to return Douglass to enslavement. Has not forgotten about him. He feels like he was his property and he escaped and he needs to go get him. Can you imagine how terrifying that was? The threat of capture, as well as the book's excellent sales in Europe, caused Douglass to travel abroad from August of 1845 to 1847, where he lectured throughout the United Kingdom. In 1846, concerned about his re-enslavement, 2 of his followers, abolitionist Anna Richardson and her sister-in-law Ellen, raised £150 to purchase his freedom from Thomas Auld. I want you to pause and think about that. Yes, it's great these women purchased his freedom, but that we lived at a time where people's freedom had to be purchased. In the spring of 1847, Douglass returned to the United States, a free man, with the money to start his own newspaper. And there's a little plaque that says, African-American abolitionist Frederick Douglass spoke here, 30th of January, 1846, a BBC history project. And I don't think that a lot of people are aware of Frederick Douglass, who he was, what he accomplished in the abolitionist movement in the Underground Railroad and so many areas, and equal rights for women as well. And there he is with his daughter. I put that picture there again. I know it's not very clear, but I love it because she dies at a very young age, his daughter. Upon his return in 1847 to the U.S., Douglass used some of his money earned from his tours, because he got paid for speaking, to fund his own abolitionist newspaper, the North Star, in Rochester, New York. So they're going to leave New Bedford, where they had moved. Basing the newspaper in Rochester ensured that the North Star did not compete with the distribution of the Liberator and the National Anti-Slavery Standard in New England. And that one of those was William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper, although they were objections from Garrison anyway, because he felt like it was competition. The North Star's first issue appeared on December 3rd, 1847. In 1851, the paper merged with the Liberty Paper Party to form Frederick Douglass's paper, which ran until 1860. He had a few papers. Douglass would publish two additional newspapers, Douglass's Monthly, 1859 to 1863, and the New National Era, 1870 to 1874. Anna and Frederick had 5 children. They grew up free and supported abolition. And helped with the North Star. Douglass's personal history and his skills as a writer and speaker set him apart from others on the abolitionist lecture circuit, and he became even more popular. I mean, this is a man that lived it. And little Annie dies at the age of 10, and I did not discover what the cause of that was, though if I searched deeper in his biography, I most likely could. As a civil rights activist, Douglass attended the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. And I had spoken about suffrage and suffragettes and this convention on the end of women's suffrage. But I did speak about Frederick Douglass. He attends it in 1848, where activist and writer Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and she's one of the leaders in the movement for women to have equal rights. It's called suffrage, and he called for a resolution on women's suffrage. This was opposed even by other female activists attending. You know, they don't feel like they're going to get the support they need, and they don't want to be seen as being so over the top that they won't ever get the support. But Douglass rose to speak and convinced the assembly that the United States needed women's voices in the political process. Stanton's Declaration of Rights and Sentiments was approved along with the resolution on women's suffrage. So it has the support of this group. Douglass would later have conflict with women's rights activists for supporting the 15th Amendment, which bans suffrage discrimination based on race while upholding sex-based restrictions. And I will explain that in a minute. But if you look down below here, you will see his name on the list of men that attended. And he was a forward thinker from the time, and this is the roll of honor. Now, what happens to cause him to do this? Why wouldn't he support women's rights to get the same rights as men? Why couldn't they be part of the 15th Amendment? Let me explain. I believe, even though he believed in women having the right to vote, he believed it would prohibit the 15th Amendment from getting passed, and that this should be done later. So he wanted enslaved Black men to be able to get the vote at this time, and the rest to come later, because he thought it wouldn't stand a chance otherwise. The move to Rochester surrounded Douglass with political abolitionists such as Gerrit Smith, During his first few years in Rochester, Douglass remained loyal to Garrison's philosophy, which promoted moral cessation, stated that the U.S. Constitution was an invalid document, mostly because it counted enslaved people as only 3/5 of a person, and discouraged participation in American politics because it was a system corrupt by slavery. In 1851, however, Douglass announced his split from Garrison when he declared that the Constitution was a valid legal document that could only be used on behalf of emancipation. Consequently, Douglass became more engaged in American politics and interpretation of the Constitution because Douglass doesn't believe that that Constitution needs to remain the way it is, and it can become a valid document, and it can get rid of enslavement. Tension around slavery or enslavement increased in the 1850s. Douglass' Rochester home was part of the Underground Railroad, and that is where I have also spoken about this, where enslaved people escape. They would have signals or information passed on to them, and they would go from home to home, making their way north, sometimes actually following the North Star. And he hosted many fellow abolitionists at his house. When Frederick Douglass returned to America in the 1850s, the Republican Party had adopted an anti-slavery, quote unquote, constitutional position epitomized by Abraham Lincoln. This view was that slavery was local, quote unquote, while freedom was national. Federal authority could prevent slavery's territorial expansion, but it couldn't interfere with existing slave states because of the Constitution. So stop and think about that. And that's why when Abraham Lincoln reads the Emancipation Proclamation at the time, he did not believe that he could free all the enslaved, including in the border states that are between the anti-slavery states and the states that have enslavement. There are border states, 4 of them, and he does not believe that he has the power to free them because of that Constitution that needs to be changed. Republicans believe this constitutional strategy would lead to slavery's ultimate extinction by preventing new slave states and shifting congressional power. This threatens Southern dominance, but the crucial difference between Lincoln and Douglass lay in their constitutional interpretation methods. Both agreed natural rights philosophy provided the Constitution's moral foundation, but they differed fundamentally on application. Lincoln's approach began with federal power questions, examining what authority the national government possessed under the Constitution's structure. Douglass' method started with natural rights themselves, asking what human equality and liberty required under constitutional principles, then working backward to find the necessary federal powers to achieve those ends, short of immediate abolition. In 1859, Douglass met with abolitionist John Brown. I bet a lot of you didn't know this. I didn't until a few years ago, in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. Brown invited Douglass to participate in the raid on the federal arsenal in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. It's now in West Virginia, and it's run by the National Park Service, and you should go visit it, which Brown hoped would inspire a massive uprising of enslaved people. Douglass received word that the authorities were looking to arrest him as an accomplice, even though he met with Brown. He did not participate in the raid, but they were going to arrest him anyway. So he quickly returns to Canada after heading to Europe for a scheduled lecture tour. He returned home in 1860 after learning that his youngest daughter, Annie, had died. Now, John Brown's uprising becomes violent at Harper's Ferry at the pump house, and he ends up getting arrested along with several other people, and John Brown is killed. And he had no regrets. And I I want to emphasize that even though Douglass didn't always agree with Lincoln, he has the greatest respect for him. And even with his limitations, so to speak, he believes that he was a good president and did the best he could under the circumstances. I didn't word that very well, but I hope you get the idea, because there's somebody that's far worse as a president coming along. With the start of the Civil War, Douglass strongly advocated for the inclusion of Black soldiers in the Union Army. He became a recruiter for the 54th Massachusetts, an all-Black infantry regiment in which his sons Lewis and Charles served. In 1863, Douglass visited the White House to meet with Abraham Lincoln to advocate for better pay and conditions for the soldiers. Lincoln then invited Douglass to the White House in 1864 to discuss what could be done for Blacks in the case of a Union loss, which thankfully did not happen. Douglass would meet with Lincoln a third time after the president's second inauguration and about a month before his assassination. The other thing I want to mention is I spoke about this when I spoke about Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment. Lincoln, when the war originally started, it was to preserve the Union. But in 1862, he changes his focus, and it is to free the enslaved. Did he still have some flaws and some things to learn? Absolutely, he wasn't perfect. But at the time, what his views were considered very radical. Actually, that's very sad if I think about it. It's kind of, let's just say that none of us are Black, none of us have, unless you're listening and you are Black, but we haven't faced enslavement and we don't know what it was like. Frederick Douglass' sons, Charles and Lewis, traveled to Massachusetts to join the 54th Infantry in April of 1863. According to the company descriptive book, which is part of his compiled service record, Charles transferred to the 5th Massachusetts Cavalry to become a first sergeant, which means on horseback. Lewis was the sergeant major, which is a big position, and was wounded in the assault on Fort Wagner, as noted on his regimental descriptive book. And to be in that battle is beyond horrific. There was a sand fort. They go through it. They are fired on. They are shooting at them. It was horrible. I'm sure he lost many friends. They were shooting down at him, the Union troops. Not the Union troops, excuse me, the Southern troops were shooting down at the 54th Massachusetts. So many of them died. And beyond that, the 7th New Hampshire, who's not a Black regiment, but it's from my host state, so I want to mention it, that they were shot at after the 54th went in. But the 54th suffered horrific injuries, but they will be a regiment until the end of the war. And there's their cards, enlistment cards, Lewis Douglass. And on the card it said promoted to sergeant major from Company F, 54th Massachusetts, March 25th, 1862. Wounded by assault at Fort Wagner, July 11th, 1863, and discharged July 29th, 1866, because of his disability. And then there's Charles's card as well. And remember, he transfers to the 5th Massachusetts Cavalry. However, all is not perfect. There's a long way to go. There's a sign that says colored men, and we would find that extremely offensive today, the use of those words. But it says freedom, protection, pay, and a call to military duty. They wanted to have U.S. colored troops. They were called that at the time. That is not my term. So this was to entice them, and they probably would get money for signing up. And then they would get pay, of course, every month. But here's the problem. It's not the same as white men would have gotten, though they were facing the same death and doing the same work. When black troops protested, they were not receiving pay and treatment equal to that of the white troops. Douglass met with Abraham Lincoln to advocate on their behalf. As the Civil War progressed and emancipation seemed imminent, Douglass intensified the fight for equal citizenship. He argued that freedom would be empty if the former enslaved were not guaranteed the rights and protections of American citizens. The 13th Amendment, ratified in 1865, abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, granted national birthright citizenship, and the 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, stated that nobody could be denied voting rights based on race, skin color, or previous certitude. But it's going to take a while before we have the amendment that gives women of any color the right to vote. So think about that. So that's where the split happened with the women's suffrage movement. And you can think about whether or not what you would have done if you were Frederick Douglass, but we certainly really can't imagine what it was like for him. But I don't think by last month's digital discussion's been posted yet, but I'm going to ask them to. And you could hear about the Emancipation Proclamation. And then, of course, the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. And trust me, not all was perfect. Blacks faced unbelievable discrimination. In 1872, the Douglass family moved to Washington, D.C. after their Rochester, New York home was burned down, and it was arson. People really hated Douglass and his advocacy. So he moved to an area where he thought it might be safer and been traveling frequently to D.C. ever since the Civil War. And as I said, even though he met with Lincoln, he didn't always agree with everything he did, but he had the greatest respect and felt like that though it's far from perfect, he did the best job that he could. This is important because I'm going to talk about the president that takes Lincoln's place in a minute. Douglass had been traveling frequently to the area ever since the Civil War. All three of his sons already lived in the federal district, and the old family home in Rochester had burned. A widely known public figure by the time of Reconstruction, which means coming together after the Civil War, which was very complicated and very difficult to do and very discriminatory for Blacks. Douglass began to hold prestigious offices, including Assistant Secretary of the Santo Domingo Commission, Legislative Council member of the D.C. Territorial Board, board member of Howard University, was a traditionally Black college or university, and president of the Freedmen's Bank. And I actually believe he was the head of the Freedmen's Bureau as well after Oliver Otis Howard. On February 7th, 1866, Frederick Douglass led a delegation of 13 representatives of the Convention of Colored Men to the White House to meet with President Andrew Johnson. Because remember, Lincoln has been assassinated in April of 1865. Unfortunately, to get some votes, he had made Andrew Johnson vice president. Previously, it had been Hannibal Hamlin. Johnson escaped being assassinated because the person that was assigned to do that when Booth and his minions went to work got drunk and didn't do it. So he escaped death. And this is from when Frederick Douglass met President Johnson, asked for the right to vote, and Johnson warned of race war. A report of that meeting appears in the papers of Andrew Johnson. Douglass and his colleagues hoped that Johnson would endorse extending the vote to Blacks. Johnson responded that giving the Black man the vote would ignite a race war. Remember, this hasn't happened yet. I talked about them getting the right to vote, and when they got it, Johnson argued that non-slaveholding whites in the South had come to hate Blacks as slaves, because as slaves, they'd given the planters a monopoly of power in the South. He said that Blacks had contempt for poor whites, a charge Douglass denied. Then Johnson said that Black status had improved greatly through emancipation, while Southern whites had seen their situation decline. Johnson said that only white legislatures of the Southern states could properly grant Blacks the right to vote, which is not true. The federal government couldn't do it, but he didn't want to. He is from Douglass had to deal with a president that in my opinion, one of the worst presidents that ever existed. He drank a lot. He didn't fight for anybody to have their rights. And people that had just gotten their freedom had such barriers to cross. So they need to get the right to vote. They finally have their freedom in 1865, December of 1865, that happens, but they don't have the right to vote. And Johnson's not going to support it. So I might go down here to the ballot box tomorrow and vote directly for universal suffrage. But if a great majority of the people said no, I should consider whether it be tyrannical in me to attempt to force upon them without their will. It is a fundamental tenet in my creed that the will of the people must be obeyed. Is there anything wrong or unfair in that? Of course it is. If you want people enslaved, that is morally wrong. If you don't want them to be able to have the right to vote, say now it's 1866, 1860, and they do have the right to vote. I mean, they are free from enslavement just for a couple of months, but they do not have the right to vote. And it's wrong. And Douglass, smiling, said, a great deal that is wrong, Mr. President, with all due respect. Yeah, there was a ton wrong with it. They couldn't vote based on their race. The president, it is the people of the United States that must for themselves determine this thing. I do not want to be engaged in a work that will commence a war of races. And that's what Johnson said. I'm sorry. I can't believe that he doesn't put the power of the federal government behind it. But he was so worried about the poor people of the South, is what his philosophy is, that no longer have people that they have enslaved. Don't agree with him at all. And at the conclusion of the discussion, Douglass made this famous reply. And this is what he said. If the president will allow me, I would like to say one or two words in reply. You enfranchise your enemies and disenfranchise your friends, meaning you support people that we fought against, and you're not supporting those who are enslaved that have just barely got their freedom and they still can't vote, and you're not putting the power of the federal government behind it. Think about that. And by the way, he was the first president to ever be impeached, well, to go through impeachment. He stayed in office till the end, but he is on the list of the worst presidents of all time. Douglass became the first African-American nominated for vice president of the United States as Victoria Woodhull's running mate on the Equal Rights Party ticket in 1872. And there she is. And I don't know if you knew that a woman actually ran for office back then. Now, Douglass had nothing to do with his nomination. He was nominated without his knowledge or consent. Douglass never campaigned. However, his nomination marked the first time that an African-American appeared on a presidential ballot. Of course, she did not win, so he did not become vice president. And this item is from the Library of Congress, Prints and Photographs Division. He founded a newspaper called New National Era. The newspaper folded in 1874 because of fiscal reasons. That same year, Douglass was appointed president of the Freedmen's Savings and Trust, also known as the Freedmen's Bank. And the bank failed 4 months after he became president because of years of corruption that predated his association with the bank. The bank's failure harmed his reputation, but he had nothing to do with it. The damage had already been done, but he worked with the U.S. Congress to remedy the damage caused to the bank. After the Freedmen's Bank fiasco, Douglass held numerous government appointments. He became the first U.S. Black Marshal in 1877 when he was appointed to that post for the District of Columbia by President Rutherford B. Hayes. He served in that capacity until 1881, when President James Garfield appointed him to the high-paying position of Recorder of Deeds for the District of Columbia. In 1889, President Benjamin Harrison selected Douglass as the U.S. Minister, Resident, and Consul General to the Republic of Haiti. A major controversy during Douglass's tenure was the quest by the United States to acquire the port town of, I should have looked this up, Molay St. Nicholas as a refueling station for the U.S. Navy because they used it a lot. Douglass disagreed with the Harrison administration's approach, preferring to promote the autonomy of the Haitian government. And he didn't agree with what Harrison wanted to do, so he resigned the position in 1891 and returned home to his home in Washington, D.C. That picture was taken in Philadelphia. Anna died of a stroke on August 4th, 1882, at their Cedar Hill home near Washington, D.C. She was buried at Mount Hope Cemetery in Rochester, New York. After Anna's death, Douglass married Helen Pitts, a feminist from Holyoke, New York. Pitts was the daughter of Gideon Pitts, Jr., an abolitionist colleague. A graduate of Mount Holyoke College, Pitts worked on a radical feminist publication and shared many of Douglass's moral principles. Their marriage caused considerable controversy since Pitts was white and nearly 20 years younger than Douglass. Douglass's children were particularly displeased with their relationship. Douglass had not told his children that he was getting married, and there was some family drama and public shaming of Douglass. Nonetheless, Pitts and Douglass remained married until his death 11 years later, and I'm not going to comment on what went on in his family because that is a family matter, and I really don't know enough to say. But I do know that his children were quite upset. And there he is with his second wife, Helen Pitts Douglass. She's sitting, and that's her sister, Eva Pitts. And they are in Washington, D.C., remember. In 1877, Douglass visited his former enslaver, Thomas Auld, on his deathbed, and the two men reconciled. And that's a picture of his home for many years before, Maryland. Douglass had met Auld's daughter, Amanda Auld Sears, some years earlier, and she had requested the meeting and attended and chaired one of Douglass's speeches. Her father complimented her for reaching out to Douglass, and the visit also appears to brought closure to Douglass, although some criticized his actions for forgiving his enslaver. And I will let you think about what you think, but remember, he was the one going through it. And this is, and I'm a big fan of statues of Lincoln, but this is a statue of Lincoln in D.C. And the keynote speaker, he was the keynote speaker at the unveiling of the Emancipation Memorial. This is the Emancipation Memorial. And Douglass wrote a critique of the depiction of the black man still on his knees. So even though the work may be fine, it's obviously Lincoln is standing, towering over the black man. What kind of message does that give when you are doing Emancipation Memorial? Both men should have been standing. On April 14th, 1876, Douglass delivered a speech at the unveiling of the Emancipation Memorial in Washington, Lincoln Park. He spoke freely about the complex legacy of Lincoln, mentioning what he perceived to be both positive and negative attributes of the late president. But trust me, I'm sure he wishes he had never, what had happened to him never did, because Andrew Johnson did not move anything forward. The crowd, roused by his speech, gave Douglass a standing ovation. Lincoln's widow, Mary Lincoln, supposedly gave Lincoln's favorite walking stick to Douglass in appreciation. That walking stick still rests in his final residence, Cedar Hill in Washington, D.C., now preserved as the Frederick Douglass National Site. In his later years, Douglass remained committed to social justice and the African American community. He became the most photographed American in the 19th century. And this is Douglass and his grandson, Joseph Douglass. He served on Howard Universities, which is a traditionally Black university/college, Board of Trustees from 1871 to 1895. Douglass developed relationships with younger activists, including Ida B. Wells, who was an abolitionist and an activist for Black rights, who featured his letter to her in her book, Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in All Its Phases. I want you to think about that because that happened to many enslaved Blacks. He also contributed to her pamphlet protesting the exclusion of exhibits dedicated to the African American culture from the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, called The Reason Why Colored America is Not in the World's Columbia Exposition. Absolutely appalling. And there is his grandson playing the violin in the late 1890s. Here is his part of his obituary. It was so long I couldn't put the whole thing on here. But February 21st, 1895, he had died. Death of Frederick Douglass by the New York Times, Washington, February 20th. So he actually died on the 20th. Frederick Douglass dropped dead in the hallway of his residence at Anacostia Heights this evening at 7 o'clock. He had been in the highest spirits and apparently in the best health despite his 78 years when death overtook him. This morning he was driven to Washington accompanied by his wife. She left him at the Congressional Library, and he continued to Meseret Hall, where he attended sessions of the Women's Council in the forenoon and in the afternoon, returning to Cedar Hill, his residence, between 5 and 6 o'clock. After dining, he had a chat in the hallway with his wife about the doings of the council. He grew very enthusiastic in his explanation of one of the events of the day when he fell upon his knees with his hands clasped. Mrs. Douglass, thinking this was part of his description, was not alarmed, but as she looked, he sank lower and finally lay stretched upon the floor, breathing his last. Realizing that he was ill, she raised his head and then understood that he was dying. She was alone in the house and rushed to the front door with cries for help. Some men who were nearby quickly responded and attempted to reassure the dying man. One of them called Dr. J. Stewart Harrison, and while he was injecting a restorative in the patient's arm, Mr. Douglass passed away, seemingly without pain. So he went very fast. So this is the press gallery, and they have some temporary pictures up, and that's an AP photo by Rod Lampkey Jr. But that was renamed just recently in honor of Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass at one point was part of the U.S. Press Corps. He was the first Black man to be part of that. And Byron Donalds, local congressman in Florida, advocated for this to happen. And it was renamed in honor of Frederick Douglass, which I think is so wonderful. We forget that he was also part of the press. And these are some of my sources. There's a great book, I forgot to bring it, called Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom by David Blight. It came out in 2019, I believe. And it, in my opinion, the definitive biography on Douglass. There's a lot of information about him. There's a lot more for you to uncover. So what I'm hoping is that I whet your appetite for more. Thank you so much for watching this. All right, I will see you next month. Thank you.